So with that, Dick, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Well, thanks for the invite. I
Appreciate
think
it.
this is a great idea. I love the idea that there are no booths out there.
We feel like we're in a booth here, right? This is.
Well, I don't know. I've been going to the RSA conference for 15, 20 years. Is it that long? It probably is.
Yeah.
And it's just gotten out of control. And to have something like this where you can actually talk to each other, thank you for doing it.
So you were born in Boston.
Boston, Massachusetts. Red Sox fan.
Red Sox fan. Okay.
The world champion Red Sox.
Good for you. Drive the nail a little deeper. What?
The third or fourth time in the century, I think.
What were you
when
kind
the
of?
Patriots don't win, the Red Sox win.
Oh, there's these sports things. I can't get this guy off the Red Sox. I'm trying to get off. Did you see my cartoon about Belichick?
No.
So we do Charlie Ciso cartoons. I hope you all saw this one. Like as a Giant fan, I had it about up to here with the Patriots. So we have two guys in a DHS office, and they're going, you know, we really need to figure out a way to think like the attackers to catch these fraudsters. What do we have to do? And in the second panel, the DHS guy goes, yeah, we need somebody who really knows fraud and deceit. And in the third panel, we have Belichick on the sideline, the guy tapping him and says, DHS needs your help, Coach Belichick. So you can go find that online. So that's my answer to your Red Sox Patriots thing. What kind of a kid were you when you were growing up? Did you think you'd be a government kind of icon as you got a little older?
So when I was 10, 11, John Kennedy got elected president. And he was from Boston. And his dad had gone to my high school. So we felt a kind of affinity with him. And, you know, he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And when you're 11 years old and you're just kind of awakening to the world and politics, and you see this local guy saying that sort of thing, yeah, it resonated. And I think probably I went to this crazy 6-year high school in Boston, public high school, and I think all the time I was there, I was getting this message of public service. And I never thought of doing anything else. It never occurred to me. And, you know, then I got into government after college, and it never occurred to me to leave, you know. It took 30 years for me to figure out how to get out.
College at UPenn.
Yeah.
What'd you study there?
Political science and sociology. And then later at MIT.
Yeah. You a Tip O'Neill fan?
Yeah, very much.
Interesting character, the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan kind of thing is something I miss.
Tip O'Neill was a great local politician. He represented a hunk of Boston and Cambridge. And even when he was Speaker of the House, you know, he'd walk the wards and shake the hands. There's a great Tip O'Neill story that the first time he ran for a local office, he lost. And he was feeling really dejected and sitting on his stoop. And the woman who lived next door, and had lived next door all of his life, walked by and said, Tip, what's the matter? And he said, well, I lost. I don't know how I lost. Everybody said they voted for me. And she said, well, Tip, I didn't. What? Mrs. McGillicuddy, you know, how could you not have voted for me? You've known me since I was born. And she looked at him and she said, you never asked me. It's a great story.
Yeah.
You have to ask in politics. You have to ask for support. You can't assume it. And a lot of people don't know that.
So entered government in doing what?
Entered government in the Pentagon at the height of the Cold War, doing nuclear weapons work in Europe, and then nuclear arms control in Europe. Then later switched to the State Department and worked my way up through the ranks in the State Department, ended up Assistant Secretary. And then the White House.
Those were those Reagan? Under Reagan?
Under Reagan, well, everybody.
Yeah, you've worked for all of them.
Yeah.
Tell us what you did under Reagan. Then I definitely want to hear what you were doing under President George H.W. Bush.
Under Reagan, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence. So it was a great job because I saw all the intelligence flow into the State Department and decided kind of who needed to see it, and ran the analysis shop to take the raw intelligence and try to figure out what it meant. It was a great job, fun job.
How about for President Bush?
So for President Bush, I was the Assistant Secretary of State during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, or as we like to call it, the good Gulf War, the Immaculate Gulf War. And also at the same time was doing arms control. So doing the end of the Cold War and doing the beginning of the new era. And then went to the White House later in his term. You know, you hear all these things now that he's being memorialized about what a nice guy he was, what a great strategic thinker he was. They're all true.
Yeah.
The guy was incredibly humble, polite, considerate, was constantly writing personal notes to people, stayed in touch with thousands of people around the world, had been our ambassador to the UN, our ambassador to China, the head of the CIA for a brief bit, and vice president for 8 years. He was probably the most qualified person who had ever been president. And he was the absolutely right guy for that moment. To handle the end of the Cold War, to not spike the football, because we won, to reunify Germany. That was all immensely challenging. And then at the same time, to do the first Gulf War, to put together a coalition of 52 countries to liberate Kuwait, and to do it with 500,000 U.S. troops. And we had 300 casualties, 300 KIA.
Yeah.
It was masterful.
Did anyone in that time period, because we're going to get to Clinton in a minute, did anybody in that time period talk about computers and hacking? And
No.
the word cyber probably wasn't in your vocabulary then.
Not at all.
Would you have ever guessed that at some point you'd be in a bunch of cyber experts talking about cybersecurity then?
No, but you know, a lot of what I did on arms control and on nuclear weapons and weapons technology was to understand the technology enough that I could translate it to the policy people. And that was the benefit of the MIT background, because that's what they taught me. To be, who's that guy in Star Wars? C-3PO?
Right.
C-3PO is the universal translator guy. I was the guy who had to translate technological things to the policy people. Because it seems to me, you know, in Washington, you're either one or the other. And the policy people are all policy people because they can't do math. No, it's true. You know, they all went to law school because they did so bad on their quantitative tests. And if anything looks like science or math, they run out of the room. So it was a niche there.
So how'd you find your way into the Clinton administration? Because that's when you first started thinking about cybersecurity, right?
Yeah, so I don't know why, but you know, whenever a presidential administration ends, everybody in the National Security Council staff is fired. And they literally come in on the last day of the administration. On January 19th, they send in troops, literally, you know, military guys, enlisted guys, and they pack up everything and take it off to a presidential library. And so when the new people come in on January 20th, there's nothing. You know, there are clean hard drives and there are sharpened pencils, you know, but no files, no background. And you wonder why our government doesn't work. Well, you know, there's no continuity. Clinton, for whatever reason, decided he needed continuity and asked me to stay for a few months. And 8 years later, same thing happened with Bush. So.
Anybody ask you your political affiliation
Never.
or anything like? Yeah.
Never.
Seems like that's an era we could sure do to bring back.
Well, you know, when they started the National Security Council under Eisenhower, they actually put in the law that over and above the Hatch Act, there are all sorts of other restrictions on NSC people so that you cannot be political. And no one ever asked me what party I was registered in.
Yeah. Tell us about your Clinton years. What were you doing in those 8 years?
The Clinton years were fun. I had this wonderful title. I was the special assistant for global affairs. And I asked, when they gave that to me, I said, what does that mean? And Tony Lake was the national security advisor. And he said, it means you're going to get all the shit jobs. If it doesn't fit in a box, it's yours. And if it's really stinky and awful and it's going to go sideways, it'll be yours. So that happened. And I ended up doing UN affairs. I ended up doing the intervention in Somalia, the intervention in Haiti, then counterterrorism. And in, I think, 1990...
First brushes with counterterrorism there?
Well, I had done that.
Ramzi Youssef was around then, right?
Oh, yeah.
92, 93.
Yeah, I spent 4 years trying to get that guy.
You tell us about that. That's a big one.
Yeah, well, so Ramzi Youssef was one of the, I think, original Al-Qaeda guys. He wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda, but he was certainly part of that ilk. And we chased him for 4 years.
Yeah.
Determined to get him, determined to bring him back. And in those days, we didn't kill terrorists, we grabbed them.
And he was the first World Trade Center bomber.
First that got away, the one that got away.
Yeah.
In those years, we grabbed them and brought them back here to Manhattan, gave them a lawyer, and tried them, and convicted every one that we brought back. We'd grab them all over the world, bring them back, read them their Miranda rights, give them a lawyer, and then try them, and every one of them got convicted. And they all went off to a place in Florence, Colorado, a supermax prison where they all went into solitary. They'd probably rather have had the death sentence than that. But it proved, I thought, that we're a nation of laws and we can deal with terrorism through that system. And then after 9/11, the Bush administration decided, no, we shouldn't do that anymore. We should kill them or we should put them in Guantanamo. And the killing them, sometimes you had to do that. But the whole Guantanamo system never worked. And people kept saying, well, we can't try them in the federal courts. And I would say, but we did. We did that for 10 years and it worked. But after 9/11, people didn't want to listen.
Were you in the White House building on 9/11?
I was the national crisis manager on 9/11.
You physically in the building that day?
Physically in the building. We evacuated the building.
Tell us what that was like that day.
Well, we evacuated the building early on. And the vice president and a few other people went to the bomb shelter in the East Wing. And I kept my team in the
By the way, this is all in the Cheney movie that's coming up, right?
Yeah, which I haven't seen yet, so I don't know how accurate it is.
Okay. And who's playing you in the Cheney movie?
I have no idea.
It's not Brad Pitt.
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Okay.
But we had high tech back then.
So Cheney went in the basement.
Yeah.
Bush was up in the air.
Bush was in Florida at a school. We had what we thought was state-of-the-art high tech. We had a wall with about 8 TV monitors, and I could hold a meeting from there, from the Situation Room. And so I had the Secretary of Defense and the CIA Director and the Deputy Secretary of State and FBI Director and everybody all in one meeting all day long. The beauty of that was they could stay in their command centers. And we ran the operation from there all day and did things that we had never done before. Like very early in the day, I said, let's ground all the aircraft. And the FAA director said, well, we've never done that. I'm not sure we can do that. And we said, well, try. And it worked. We got every aircraft down in about an hour. There were like 2,400 aircraft aloft. There were aircraft coming in from Europe, which we landed in Canada.
Yeah.
Aircraft coming in from the Pacific, which we either turned around or landed in Canada. It was a very intense day where we went to nuclear alert. The first time since 1973 that we went to DEFCON 3. We buttoned down the country pretty quickly. We closed all the borders, closed all the harbors, because we didn't know what was coming next. There were 4 aircraft that had been hijacked. We initially were told the number was 11. And we were told one of them was headed toward us, toward the White House. And I think probably one of them was either headed toward us or the Capitol. And I'm not sure where it was going to go, one or the other. But it took a damn long time for us to get fighter aircraft over the city. Damn long time.
I watched them. I was in D.C. and I remember I was outside and they swooped down and I thought it was the enemy. I was face down literally in a field
I
in
kept
Washington.
screaming all morning for CAP, for Combat Air Patrol cover, and finally when they got it, just to prove to me that they did it, they had 2 F-15s go right over the White House at about 100 feet
Right.
off the ground.
I saw them.
Yeah.
Right.
I heard them.
That was something. What was going through your mind? Because you, in a career that had built to that point for you, you'd been thinking about this. You chased Ramzi Youssef. I mean,
Look, we knew.
You knew it was bin Laden.
I knew it was bin Laden. I knew, for maybe 9 months from intelligence reporting that Al-Qaeda was planning a major attack on the U.S. CIA told me it would be overseas, but I had no reason to believe them. With their track record, they're not always right.
Right.
So we knew there would be a major Al-Qaeda attack. What we didn't know was where, when, exactly. I thought it would be around the first week in July. It was off a couple of months. Where, when, or how. We did not know that they were going to hijack aircraft, obviously.
So soon after, you started thinking about cybersecurity.
No, before.
Before.
Well, before.
Take us through kind of how this this theme of your learning helps you and has helped you and helps us deal with a new threat, the cybersecurity.
So, after the Oklahoma City bombing, which you remember was an 18-wheeler truck filled with explosives, blew an entire federal building down, and other buildings for blocks around.
Killed a lot of kids.
Killed a lot of kids. The president said, let's do a review of our vulnerability. What if that 18-wheeler had been at an AT&T node?
Yeah.
Or on some key bridge somewhere. Let's do a review of our vulnerability. What are the critical nodes in this country, and how vulnerable are they? Well, the first thing I said was, the White House is one of them, and it's very vulnerable. And he said, what do you mean? I said, if you put that 18-wheeler on Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House would be leveled.
Yeah.
So the next day I closed Pennsylvania Avenue. People have never gotten over that. They don't like me for that. But we established a commission, and we got General Marsh out of retirement, Air Force General, to run it, and gave him a good-sized staff and a fair amount of money and said, come back in 18 months. And he did, and he came back with a very thick report, and it was all about cybersecurity. He said, he and the commission said...
What year was this?
This is 97.
97.
They said, during your presidency, Mr. Clinton, the world has changed. It's changing in front of us. And the entire country is now becoming dependent on information networks.
Right.
Dependent. Without those networks running, the country won't run. This hadn't been true 10 years earlier. Now it was true. No one ever said that before. No one ever sat down and said, let's make a decision as a country to become dependent on IT networks. There was no decision. There was no law that the Congress had passed. There was no national plan or anything. It happened. And it was great because our productivity went through the roof because of it. If you look at the productivity by years, you get to the early mid-90s and it goes right through the roof.
Yeah.
But this commission said it creates a dependency and a vulnerability. And you need a plan to deal with that vulnerability because there will be malicious actors. That commission absolutely nailed it. And so the president read it and looked at me and said, so you're in charge of this now? I said, no. No. I have a job, thank you very much, and I know nothing about this. And he said, well, no one else does either, which it wasn't true, but it was true in the government. It was at least true in the policy world. No one
Civilian government.
Yeah. And like NSA,
NSA, no.
Ken Minahan was out at NSA doing great things, but not too many people knew about that.
Right.
So I got stuck with this job. And I said, I don't know shit about this. And I thought, well, I can call Microsoft, Cisco, Oracle, and since I'm calling from the White House, I can call the CEO.
Yeah.
So I did. And I went to the CEOs at Microsoft and Oracle and Cisco and Symantec and said, you got to teach me about this. And I had a fire hose education from all of those companies. And what I realized was they were all in silos. You guys at AT&T were doing a great job of what you did,
Yeah.
but you didn't worry about the fact that the Microsoft software sucked. Well, you might have worried about it,
I worried about it.
but you couldn't do much about it, right?
It's gotten better.
It's gotten a lot better.
Yeah.
It couldn't get any worse from what it was. But all of these people were worrying about routers, they were worrying about networks, they were worrying about operating systems. Nobody was looking at it holistically.
Yeah.
And then I went out to NSA and spent a few days and said, show me what we can do. And it was mind-blowing back then. And I came back to the White House and said, I'm not sure we should worry about this cybersecurity stuff because if other people can do what NSA can do, there's no way of defending against it.
Yeah.
And I think at that point in time that was true.
Yeah.
Not true now.
The PDD 63 came out of that work. I still think that's one of the finest works. I make my graduate students still look at that thing. Tell us about that. That's a really, really important document. If you haven't ever read it, that's your homework. Go off and a little history lesson. But how'd that come?
PDDs are presidential decision documents.
Right.
And I wrote a directive on cybersecurity that was the first time we'd had a national policy on cybersecurity, comprehensive national policy. And it called, among other things, for a national strategy. And then in the Bush administration, we wrote that strategy. And we did it. We didn't want to sit down in the White House and write something and just throw it into the public arena.
This is the George W. Bush administration,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, George W.
What we did was we asked every industry, and at the time I think we had 12 industry groups. Now I think there are 17 critical infrastructure groups. But we asked 12 industries to organize themselves for the purpose of talking about cybersecurity. And we gave them an antitrust waiver and said, we want you to get together as an industry and think about vulnerabilities and think about solutions and come back to the White House with how you're going to deal with that. And then so while we were doing that across industry groups, we also went around the country and we held 10 White House town hall meetings in 10 different cities around the country to try to, A, educate folks about it, but B, get feedback that way too from the public, from the concerned public. And after all of that process, we issued the first national strategy. And, I did go back and read it recently because I'm writing another book on cybersecurity. It's a pretty damn good
It is
strategy.
good, right?
Yeah.
It's not that much different from everything that's been written since. Do I have that right?
You do, and the Trump administration, believe it or not, has issued a national chapter.
Right.
It's about that thin.
Yeah.
But it essentially...
It's not so bad. I mean, it's
no,
the same.
Actually, I think
it's
Rob
okay.
Joyce wrote it.
Right. Rob
So,
did a good job
Rob's
on
a
that.
good guy.
I liked
That's
it.
probably why he gets fired. But
Yeah.
in any event, it's pretty much, it's the same strategy. It really is.
Yeah, yeah. So, what do you worry about now? I mean, it's almost like you've had the perfect training to think about some pretty terrible things that can happen. You're one of the few who've made that crossover between, say, the non-technical threats that we worry about and all of us doing tech and cyber. So you're one of us. When you put those things together, sitting here in 2018, what do you worry about?
And so the transition of the threat has been so gradual that we kind of missed it. But there has been a transition of the threat. You know, in the late 90s, when I started really focusing on this, the threat really was often that kid in his mother's basement with Red Bull and pizza.
Yeah.
And then it evolved into organized gangs, criminal organizations, frequently in sanctuary countries, so we couldn't get at them. If you look at the major attacks of the last 4 or 5 years, it's military organizations.
Yeah.
And we know who they are. And the beauty of the Justice Department approach now is they're naming names and showing pictures. So they've indicted named names of Russians, Iranians, North Koreans, Chinese, military intelligence officers by name with photographs indicted in U.S. courts. And that's a switch, you know. NotPetya was a Russian military intelligence operation. NotPetya was probably the most damaging in terms of dollar cost of any cyber attack ever. Can argue about how much money it cost, but it's one reasonable estimate is $20 billion.
Yeah.
And it shut things down. It shut down ports all over the world.
Yeah.
It shut down pharmaceutical companies.
Merck got hit.
Yeah, shut down lots of things. And what's fascinating about NotPetya is it was not intentional. All of that damage was collateral damage. The Russians were trying to destroy things in Ukraine, and they did. They put a wiper virus on about 10% of the devices in Ukraine. 10%. But it escaped, just like Stuxnet, actually. But the difference was when Stuxnet escaped, it was so precisely designed that even though it may have infected the machine, it then checked to see if that machine was an Iranian centrifuge. And if you weren't an Iranian centrifuge, it didn't attack you. NotPetya wasn't like that. It got out over VPNs from Ukraine to corporate offices all over the world and started wiping things out. The Russians didn't intend to do that. They're just so sloppy and careless that there was enormous collateral damage. But what it told us, if we needed to be told again, was what that kind of attack could look like if it were intentional. If you had a wiper attack that was designed to take down critical infrastructure, it could have taken down a lot.
If it can happen by accident, it can happen by intent.
Right.
Yeah.
Only worse.
Yeah. Now, well, the vast majority of the people in the room here are not in a military organization. In fact, almost all. So it seems like an unfair fight, right? I mean, if it's us against China or in other countries, them against the U.S.
Yeah, it is an
that doesn't
unfair
seem so what are we supposed to do?
Well, you know, Keith Alexander has been talking along these lines, saying, you know, those of us in the corporate world, we pay our taxes to be defended against foreign militaries. Why don't we have the U.S. military defend our companies? Well, do you really want that?
Yeah.
Do you really want, first of all, there's an assumption there, which is that the U.S. military would be better at it than you are. That's kind of an erroneous assumption. The U.S. military has been hacked too, including some
Right.
pretty sensitive classified networks.
Right.
Have been hacked.
Cybernet has gotten viruses. Sure.
Cybernet, indeed.
Sure.
Cybernet's the classified network, well, one of them. The White House has been hacked. The State Department's been hacked.
Sure.
OPM has been hacked. How many of you had your entire background history stolen by
Yeah.
the Chinese from OPM?
Easier to ask who didn't.
Yeah, right. So the notion that the government can do it better than corporations can, I think that's not a proven assumption.
They can probably do offense better than anyone. You give them that.
They can do offense better.
Offense is easier.
They can do offense better, but the question there is, do you really want to engage in an all-out war?
And you know I don't. I'm very much against it. But I'm just thinking for all of us, it's a confusing situation because it feels like in World War II, it was the government fighting, and it was Rosie the Riveter and war bonds and people being the society supporting. And now it's flipped, and now it feels like all of us on the front and government behind the scenes trying to, DIS and DHS trying to help and so on. And it just seems weird to
I know
me.
the frustration, and the best example of it was the Iranian DDoS of the banks.
Yeah.
So
One of the worst few weeks of my life.
yeah,
actually.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
So just, you all know the story, but just to refresh, we attacked their nuclear enrichment facilities, which, by the way, were not online. It's kind of a neat trick to get into their plant and wipe out all their software. Anyway, allegedly, the United States did that. Got to say that. They then retaliate by doing this massive DDoS attack on our banks. And it's of a scale and size that no one had ever seen before.
Yeah.
Had a really hard time dealing with. And the CEOs in the banks, down the street here, you got their attention. We got to the CEO level pretty quickly. And their question was, what's the government doing about it? And the answer was nothing. And so the CEOs in many of these banks started calling into the White House, the Obama White House, and saying, hey, what do we pay our taxes for? Why aren't you defending us? And the Obama administration said, that's your job. I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of people in the private sector, that you really are on your own when a Russian or an Iranian or a North Korean military unit attacks you.
The industry at that time was selling DDoS protection in units of 1 gig.
Yep.
And by the end of the weekend of that attack, a lot of the DNS instances were being hit with a first 100 gig attack that we'd seen.
And
so you can imagine, that was not a great time.
And it could happen again, and it could be much worse than that.
Yeah.
So you can button down your corporation, but then an attack that hits the DNS system, as the Mirai attack did with Dyn, an attack that goes after the BGP system and routes traffic, which is, by the way, happening all the time.
Yeah.
No one doing anything about it. Something that's a massive DDoS against the right nodes, or an attack against the electric power grid. And we've got the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, on the record before the Senate this year saying the Russians have penetrated the control plane of the U.S. power grid. So you can button down your company, but if any of those things happen, you're not in business.
Does the popular media get this right, or do you sit at home like in your pajamas throwing things at the TV, or do you think a lot of the reporting is right?
I think there's a belief in a lot of the American public that watches fiction, where any hacker can hack into anything in a minute and turn out the lights in Moscow. There's an episode of Madam Secretary, those of you who watch that show, where the president says, damn the Russians, I want the lights turned out in Moscow. And then you see the lights go out in Moscow. It ain't that easy.
Right.
And one of the dirty little secrets is that Cybercom, until very recently, was not authorized and was not engaged in attacking the military organizations of potential enemies. They were not getting inside Russian radars or North Korean missiles. We always assumed they were. And then through a number of interesting discussions and hearings, we learned they were not. The Obama administration had said no, anything like that has to be approved in advance by the president. Now, apparently, Trump has undone that policy and authorized Secretary Mattis to approve military operations, and allegedly they are now implanting themselves in foreign military organizations. But if the Russians are implanting themselves in our power grid, and we are now attempting to implant ourselves in their missile systems and their radars, I mean, that's a level of instability, of crisis instability, that we haven't had in a long time.
That's a little frightening. We need to lighten this up. Everybody's going. Tell us about Colbert. How many times you been on his show?
4 or 5. I never thought when I was in the government that my post-government career would involve lots of comedy.
What's he
shows.
like? Is he as good as me at interviewing?
Colbert's brilliant, and he was a song and dance guy originally. And the first time I was on, like, when's the rehearsal?
Right.
Like, there's no rehearsal. He's just going to wing it. The one time he didn't wing it, he called and said, I've seen this news story about gorillas in a zoo that were given iPads, and they were pretty good with them. So I'm wondering, where is this going? He said, I want you to come on the show and say that that's a threat to critical infrastructure. So, we got the Russians, we got the Chinese, but now we have a new threat, guerrilla war. And I said, okay, I can do that. So I went on the show and played it absolutely straight. And then all of my friends called up after the show and said, that's really not a threat, Dick. What are you worried about? Like, that was a comedy act. So apparently I'm not very good at comedy.
Tell us about you have a new book coming out. Tell us a little bit about that.
So 10 years ago, I wrote with Rob Kanaki a book called Cyber War.
Yeah. Rob is a brilliant guy.
That's why he's my co-author.
Yeah.
I'm not that dumb. And the purpose of Cyber War was to scare people in the policy community who didn't know any of this stuff. And maybe it was a little hyperbolic, maybe. But it did get people's attention. And it did get the readership that I wanted it to have. I was at a conference in Munich after the book came out, and this big, tall guy came up to me and said, I think you should pay me a commission. I said, okay, why? He said, I made 50 people read your book. I made 50 people buy your book. And I said, oh, who are you exactly? I am the president of Estonia. Good. So it had the right effect. It came out in Chinese before it came out in English, and not because we gave it to them. So, I think it was an influential book. That was 10 years ago. And so we thought, let's revisit the issue and see how the world has changed. So the new book comes out in July. It's called The Fifth Domain. The military has domains, so they can dominate domains. Air, land, sea, space, and the fifth domain is cyberspace. And this book is not a scare book. This book is a book that says, we actually have the capability now to solve this problem. That the tools we need exist. And there are a lot of places that are pretty damn secure. We hear about the Marriotts and the Equifaxes and all the companies that get hacked. What you don't hear about is the ones that don't get hacked. And there are a lot of companies that either don't get hacked, or when they do, it doesn't have a big effect on them. because they're doing it right. So it's kind of a positive message saying, this is not an insolvable problem. But to do it well, we need some better national leadership. We need some better national policies. We actually might need the Congress to do something occasionally, which is, I know, asking a lot. But the tools are there. We then also, however, look at, with all of this, you're painting a moving train. So where is the train moving? Where is it headed? How does AI, machine learning, how does quantum computing, which, by the way, is about to really work, and how does the explosion of the Internet of Things, how do these new technological changes change the cyber challenge? And are we thinking about that? Because always with cybersecurity, people rush out and deploy new technologies, and then after the fact say, oh, yeah, we need to defend that. We didn't build security in, now we have to glom it on, and that doesn't work. So one of the things we're talking about in the book is let's get ahead of the curve and think, how could we use machine learning? How could we use quantum computing? How can we deal with the Internet of Things so that we minimize the cyber risk and actually maybe turn it around and use those things to increase cybersecurity?
It strikes me, and I spent time with your co-author, that the cyber problem is getting better, but the information problem is getting worse. Like the idea of making, like there's a lot of companies represented here, their CEO could be putting a fake video, saying really stupid things.
Yeah.
I know machine learning will help detect fake stuff, but boy, that's frightening now.
It'll also help generate the fake stuff.
Generate fake stuff. So that, I think we're shifting. I think the Russians picked that up before we did. They figured out that it's an information war, and we were fighting a cyber war.
And they're fighting, they're fighting what we used to call psychological war.
Right.
Or influence operations.
Yeah. They seem to figure that out. Yeah.
They've combined hacking with their traditional, and by the way, it goes back over 100 years, their operations, influence operations, disinformation, compromat, all the stuff that the KGB did throughout the 20th century, they're now supercharging by using internet tools to do. People say, oh, how could we possibly have known that they would do something to our election? Well, if you step back, they've been doing things to elections in Europe for years. They've been engaged in compromat for years, disinformatia for years. The only difference, and against the United States. What they had never done, however, was to put all of that together against the United States and our election. They never dared to do that. And now they did it, and they got away with it.
Interesting.
And it worked. And we really haven't done much about it.
I want you all to start thinking about your questions. If you have them, raise your hand. If I were to come to your house, what is the absolute coolest thing you either took, stole, or were given from the White House? Because everybody steals something, whether it's a napkin. I have some stolen stuff. It's napkin-y type stuff. No, no news here, but
they really don't let you. The Secret Service is pretty good.
Yeah,
they really don't let you carry shit out of the White House.
What would be if I came to your house, or any of the folks here? We come in and we say, "Show us your shelf." What would we see? I bet you have some amazing stuff.
No,
there.
I don't, because there's something.
Come on, you do.
There's something that a lot of people do in Washington, and I can't stand it, and that is they create an "I love me" wall. It's like a monument to themselves. Them and this president, them and that president. Awards they were given, and I could never stand that.
Note to self: change office.
I don't like it. I never did.
You're never coming to my house, but tell me what you got.
I have one thing that comes to mind, and that is I have an apron that says the White House on it.
Where'd you get that from the
from the
kitchen?
White House mess? Yeah.
What was it? What was the food like there?
Great.
It's pretty good.
Yeah. The White House mess was one of the very few. People think, oh, you work in the White House, you must have a lot of perks. First of all, the White House is tiny. It's 200 years old, and it looks it and feels it. And there aren't a lot of perks. But one of them is this thing called the White House Mess, and it's run by the Navy. And it's the best cooks in the Navy, best chefs in the Navy, want to get into that job and do that job for a few years before they get out of the Navy and go open a restaurant somewhere. And so, yeah, we had great food.
Well, that's good. I still think you must have some cool stuff. What kind of questions do we all have for Dick? Question was, how did you divert these airplanes on 9/11?
Yeah, the Canadians were the heroes of 9/11. We landed planes, giant 747s and things, in little towns in Labrador and Newfoundland that had runways long enough. And there weren't hotels to take those thousands of Americans. And what happened that day was Canadians took the passengers into their homes. Thousands of Canadians literally opened their homes to passengers who were stranded. And if you remember, we did not start flying again the next day. I didn't want to reinitiate flying until we had decent security at the airports, and we didn't have TSA. We had to invent TSA after that. So we had to put together an ad hoc version of TSA, and it took about 4 days to do that. And if you remember, the first few days we did resume flying. That was a little rough. Probably took you 3 hours to get through security at the airports. But so the Canadians were stuck with thousands of people for several days. And the Canadian government was great, absolutely great.
We have here Pete Cornell, who at the time was running all of operations for AT&T, and we felt like we planned for everything. And the first page of when New York City switches go down is fly new resources into the area.
Right.
And we went, oh,
Yeah.
we didn't account for that.
No.
So that was an issue.
But your industry also stepped up in a big way. All of the carriers, Verizon, AT&T, and people from other parts of the country, all moved equipment to New York.
Yeah.
And the president wanted the stock market to reopen as soon as possible. And we couldn't. Just the connectivity was shot because of the damage that was done in the attack. And he said, okay, look, you got to get it open by Monday or Tuesday of next week. So, as you may remember, we laid fiber optic cable down the sidewalk.
Yeah, I do remember.
We just closed Lower Manhattan and no time to dig trenches. We just laid fiber optic cable down the street.
Yeah.
And got the market up enough so that we could do a test on Monday and open the market again on Tuesday. So it was from Tuesday to Tuesday. It was closed because, frankly, there was no connectivity. But everybody that showed up, needed to have a badge to get through the police lines. And Verizon just gave everybody a badge that said Verizon, whether you're from AT&T or Level 3 or whoever. Verizon badged everybody.
It's an amazing time.
It worked.
Another thing I remember, Verizon, AT&T, all of us, we had our trucks in New Jersey, and we all had logos on our trucks. And the government came and said, you can't have logos on these things. That becomes a target. So we bought these big blankets and put them over, it looked like all these tablecloths on all these things. The most bizarre thing I ever saw in my life, because nobody had ever thought, don't put your logo on the truck.
Look, we overreacted to the attack.
Yeah.
Because we were traumatized.
Yeah.
And I think, you talked about the Dick Cheney movie that's coming out on Christmas Day. It's perfect timing. Nice cheery movie for Christmas Day. I think in that movie, you'll probably see him going through a metamorphosis and overreacting. We did. We overreacted in a lot of ways because we didn't know how big the threat was. We didn't know what would be coming next.
I got a call from him one time. I was driving to his office. My boss and I were told to get on the phone. I pulled over, and as the call started, mid-sentence, he was already yelling at us. And I was like, I thought it was a joke, but it was not great. Question in the back. Yes. So did everybody hear the questions about IP theft from China? Seems to be going up. What are the policy issues? What do you recommend? What are you seeing?
So in your question, you talked about the President Xi Obama agreement. And it was a major accomplishment, and it didn't get a lot of attention. So let me just recap what that agreement was. Susan Rice was National Security Advisor. She went to Beijing, and she said, President Xi is going to come and have a meeting in the White House with President Obama. We want to solve a problem before that happens, so the meeting doesn't just dissolve into our yelling at you about this one thing. And they said, what's that? And she said, you have to stop hacking American companies. And they said, well, we don't do that. And she said, for those of you who know Susan Rice, she said, cut the bullshit. We know you do it, and you have to stop doing it. And they said, well, you do it too. And she said, well, actually, we don't, but because we don't, I will agree not to do it. And they said, well, how are you defining this? And she said, look, we'll continue to hack your military, we'll continue to hack your government, we'll continue to hack your intelligence operations, and you can do that to us. That's fun. That's intelligence. That's what we do. But when you hack into U.S. Steel, or she named several companies that we knew they had hacked into, and you steal intellectual property, and then you give it to a Chinese company that then competes against that American company, we're paying for the R&D. The American companies are paying for the R&D, and then your guys are getting it for free and then underselling our companies. That has to stop. And they said, well, we're not doing it. And it went on for months. And it worked its way up to President Xi, who then asked his deputy, his right-hand man, go find out actually what we're doing. Because apparently he didn't know the full extent of it.
Is that true?
I think it's true.
Yeah.
And the deputy came back and said, yeah, this is what we do. This is how we do a lot of R&D this way. And he said, okay, look, can we get by without doing this? And they said, well, no, but we can stop doing it to the Americans.
That actually makes me even less comfortable, right?
Well,
there's nothing coming out of there anymore.
So they signed the agreement, and then, if you talk to the guys at FireEye and Palo Alto and whatnot, they really did see a drop,
yeah.
Significant drop. But the Germans started getting it because they just shifted their target. Now, because of the deterioration in U.S.-Chinese relations and the tariff war and all of that, that agreement's void. And they're doing it again. They're doing it again in the big way.
Let me repeat. So globalism versus nationalism. This has now devolved into a pure political science discussion, but that's okay. You got the right guy. So let's have at it.
I don't know that there's a definition of nationalism. President Trump says he's a nationalist, but he's never quite defined what that means. You can build a definition out of what he's doing. He seems to think that the best way to help our country, this whole America First notion, is to do more or less America alone. And he's ripping up agreements, he's ripping up alliances in a global world. It's a global economy. You may not like that, but there's nothing you can do about that. You can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. In a global economy, you have to act as a global power, economically, politically. And the way you do that is through international agreements. The things that he wants to get rid of are things that the United States built in order to help the United States. If you look at NATO, which he says is terrible because they don't pay their bills, well, there aren't any bills, which is one of the reasons people don't pay them. NATO was a U.S. design to get other people to carry some of the burden. Same thing with the UN. So, oh, the UN's terrible. We designed it, and it works well for our interests. We had a trade agreement that took years to develop with all the nations in the Pacific, including the Latin American nations in the Pacific, that was designed to help us, and he ripped it up the day he got into office. That nationalism, in the sense of going it alone, won't work. You have to play multilateral politics, and you have to play it skillfully, because you have to give a little to get a little. Sometimes you have to give things that are painful, but overall, the benefits are real. I think right now the United States is politically isolated in the world. That great agreement that we had for trade in the Pacific, since we didn't do it, the Chinese did. And now they're reaping the benefits that we could have had. I think it's, if nationalism means going it alone and doing things unilaterally, I think it's a disaster. And unfortunately, that seems to be the policy.
Are there any negotiations around cyber norms and things like that at the global level? It seems like there's not, like where there's agreement amongst nations to...
There's not much. You know, there is something called the Budapest Convention, which was originally called the European Cybercrime Convention. It's a good starting point. You could build on it. You could give it teeth. You could say, for example, that we'll all exchange information on where attacks come from, and we'll all be able to say, you know, you, Romania, go get that guy.
For one more.
And if you don't, then there'll be a price to pay. You know, put sanctions on countries that become cyber sanctuaries. You could do that by just building a little, amending the Budapest Convention. That's not happening.
Seems like the norms should be something that is such an obvious
But
thing.
there's discussion
like
of norms.
Agreement, like Red Cross type things.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Look, there are discussions of norms, but there's no discussion, there's no real international negotiation the way we did arms control, nuclear arms control.
Right.
I think we can do cyber arms control. People say to me, oh, that's impossible. Look, when I did nuclear arms control, biological arms control, chemical arms control, conventional forces in Europe arms control, people said, oh, that's impossible. And we did it. It took years. It was painful. We got verification measures and all of that. I think we can do it with cyber war. I think we can have an international arms control agreement that is better than what we have now. It's not going to be perfect. The verification won't be perfect. But we have to start that process. And what this administration has done is to literally close the office in the State Department that was working on that.